Hi, and welcome to this live reading from the Dating Itinerary by Brooke Williams, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Penny Coyne worried she looked like a disco ball, or perhaps a baked potato. Why had she let her sister talk her into this outfit? She adjusted her silver shirt and surveyed the crowd. She'd never been to a speed dating event before, but it looked like a pretty decent showing to her. The restaurant had their private room closed off in the back, ready for the event. Tables for two sat scattered about the room with candles at the center. Penny's nerves were at an all-time high. She'd never been good at dating, and now she had to do it for a living. She hoped the dim lighting would hide the shaking of her hands. The room was made for romance, or at least it looked like the romantic situations she always saw in the movies. It would be nice if real life worked like that. Boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love, the couple live happily ever after. Penny shook her head. What was she expecting? Some kind of miracle? She adjusted her shiny shirt as a stray light caught it and sent a reflection across the room. Here goes nothing. She signed in with the attendant at the front table and received a small clipboard of her own. Keep track of the men by their first names and the numbers pinned to their chest. The small woman pushed glasses up her nose and glanced at Penny. Could she look any more bored, Penny wondered. No last names allowed, the woman continued in her monotone voice. Penny was doing her best to take in the information. She needed to know, not only to survive the evening, but also for her ulterior motives. Turn your clipboard in at the end of the night with the names and numbers of the men marked that you want to get to know after the event. Penny shook her head. The woman had still not changed her inflection. She would make a good science teacher. At the end of the night, if the men mark you on their sheets as well, you will get their numbers and they will get yours. Penny blinked. Her nerves were ramping up, and the sudden stop of the monotonous tone forced her back into the reality of the situation. Penny chewed on her bottom lip. Was she supposed to ask a question? She really wanted to know how long the calculations would take. Would she have to mill around with men that she had rejected, or who had rejected her? Was she even allowed to ask? She wasn't sure how long she could hide the lump in her throat or the shake in her hands. This wasn't just another day at the office, after all. She had a job to do, but if she was being completely honest, she'd love to meet someone someday. This wasn't her ideal situation, but it was still an opportunity. She jotted a few notes to the side of her clipboard about the setting within the room. She'd have to remember as much as possible. The night would be busy with man after man once things started up. That wasn't a phrase Penny planned to use in her article. She'd been waiting for a feature in St. Louis Happenings magazine for years, but this wasn't exactly how she pictured getting it. It would have been nice if she'd been recognized for her investigative reporting piece on the cafeteria food in the local schools, or the in-depth interview she'd done with the mayor, but no, when the idea of a dating segment came up at a staff meeting, everyone had turned to her. Sure, she was pushing 30 and still single, but that didn't make her a spinster, did it? The women were on one side of the room and the men on the other. Penny joined the group of women as they inspected the men from afar. Most of the women had too much makeup on, even for the dim lighting. Comparing herself to them, Penny felt underdone. She was wearing way more makeup than she did on an average day. She'd taken the time to line her eyes and apply a smoky shadow and some bright lip gloss, but that was as far as she was willing to go, and it was over the top for her. Now it looked like she had the natural look going, while the rest of the women, well, they looked anything but natural. The men, from what she could tell, were thin and gangly, all elbows and knees, as her aunt used to say. They certainly weren't trying as hard as the women, if the makeup jobs and tight clothing she saw around her were any indication. Penny took her time surveying the men. With one inspection, she wasn't sure there was much potential for her. She had preferences, and she didn't see them manifesting before her. In the center of the group of men, a man she hadn't noticed before stepped out from behind two other men. Penny drew in a breath. He wasn't facing the women, but his shoulders were broad and his waist narrow. Even without seeing his face, she knew there would be an attraction, at least on her end. She'd always been drawn to the athletic type who spent way too much time in the gym. The problem was their personalities didn't usually measure up, and Penny got hurt. It had been the story of her life in the dating world. The first heart-stomping happened earlier in high school when she dated the star of the track team for nearly a year, only to have him run off, quite literally, with the captain of the girls' track team. Her heart was torn in two, but she wasn't completely broken. At that point, she was willing to keep trying. Then there was a football player who went off to Ivy League schools, leaving her behind. She really thought he'd write and call, but he just dropped her like a bad habit. It was crushing to feel she meant so little. Once she got to college, Penny let herself fall again, this time for the pitcher on the college baseball team. But their relationship hadn't meant as much to him as it did to her, because when he got a call from a minor league team, he was gone faster than his pitches. All he left behind was a brief goodbye note. And then the man who really did her in, the local gymnastics coach who almost went to the Olympics himself but got injured and ended up coaching. Penny shook her head as his tapered waist floated through her mind. He had left her when one of his gymnasts had gotten the opportunity to train at a state-of-the-art facility in Houston. Penny still wondered if it was the gymnast and the opportunity, or more the gymnast's gorgeous divorced mom that was behind his disappearance. Her past experiences were part of the reason she didn't want to bother trying anymore. The right-looking men were never right for her in the end. They left her behind without a second thought, or so it seemed to her. Time and time again, her heart was trampled, and she wasn't sure it could handle another breaking experience. Maybe it was time for her to change her tastes and throw her type out the window. She did want to meet someone and find a partner to spend her life with. She just had to guard her heart and be careful about it this time. Perhaps she had been looking in the wrong places, or at least at the wrong men. She giggled nervously as the women around her prattled on about the adventure the night before them was sure to bring. Their fast speech and waving gestures were enough to tell Penny that many of them were high on nerves as well. She didn't have much to add because she had no idea what to expect, but she needed to fit in, and her laughter was helping her forget her nerves. Several of the women spoke as if they were regulars, but she could tell there were other first-timers there as well. Penny was likely the only one trying to collect details for an article, and for a local TV morning news appearance to go along with it. If she met someone, great, but she was determined not to leave empty-handed either way. "Ladies and gentlemen," a small older woman clapped her hands in the center of the room. "Welcome to tonight's speed dating event. For those of you who are new, I'll go over the rules." Penny drew in her breath and brushed her short copper hair away from her eyes as the man with the broad shoulders turned toward the voice of the little woman. She couldn't see his face well, but his hair flopped down over his forehead a bit too long for its own good. Check, Penny thought. Another feature she found attractive. He was sure to have a dud of a personality. He probably lived with his mom or had another red flag of some sort. "Ladies, in a few moments I'll ask you to take a seat at a table. Once you're settled, the men will be placed in random order. You'll hear a bell ring every 2 minutes with a 30-second interval between. When the bell rings, men, you'll rotate clockwise to a new table. Ladies, you stay put. Be sure to mark your charts as you go so there aren't any mistakes or missed connections later. Keep in mind that if there are any matches tonight, and we know there will be, the lucky couples get a voucher for a free meal here sometime in the next month. We want to foster the love we start, right?" The woman nudged her elbow into the non-existent person beside her. "On that note, let's get started. I'll be working my way around the room all evening long, so if you have any questions, feel free to shout out. Ladies, grab a table. Let the love begin." She threw her arms in the air and snapped her fingers. Penny watched as the women around her scurried to their places. They were probably the regulars and had favorite tables they felt were the best for romance. Penny followed the group and sat at a table near the wall. It didn't really matter, did it? All of the men would work their way around to every table. She kept the corner of her eye glued to the man with the shoulders. If he sat at her table first, she'd probably leave with him and skip the rest of the night. If only she could guarantee he liked pixie haircuts and baked potato-like shirts. But this wasn't about attraction alone. It was also about research. This wasn't the only dating avenue she had to take. The staff at the St. Louis happenings had a whole list of things for her to try. They were calling it the Dating Itinerary, and it was going to keep her busy for weeks. In some ways, it was good. A weekly feature column and an appearance on the local morning news about her experiences was going to be the highlight of her career. But Penny was in for the long haul tonight, and she knew it. The magazine told her she could end up with a front cover story, but only if there was a success in her love life at the end of the featured columns. But first, speed dating. There was no way for her to find out how the entire process worked unless she sat the night out. "Gentlemen, if I could have you get in the line, please." The host pointed men to a table, one after another, as they began to filter through the restaurant to their assigned places. Penny watched a guy approach her table. He gave a slight bow and pulled out his chair. "Hi," Penny began, extending her hand across the table. "Shh," he placed a finger to his lips. "We're not supposed to talk until the bell rings." Penny frowned. From the mumble in the room, she could tell others had started talking, but whatever. This must be one of the regulars since he seemed to know the rules so well. She took the minute before the bell rang to survey his appearance. His polo shirt was wrinkled and buttoned all the way to his neck. He looked young, maybe early 20s, and Penny wondered what his dating background was. She would have asked, but she was afraid of getting shushed again. His dirty blonde hair was spiked way too high, as if he had spent an hour combing and spraying. As the bell rang, she smiled. Here goes nothing. Every man in the room deserved a chance. Okay, so my name is Norman, and I live with my mom, he began. That's quite an opening line, Penny thought. I'm Penny, and I don't. She wasn't sure what else to say. I just start things off that way so women know what they're getting into. If it comes up later, they feel like I hid it from them, and I didn't want you to think I was hiding anything. Okay. Penny glanced at the next table where the red-haired man sat. Perhaps things would start off better with him. How old are you, Norman? 23, just last week. Do you do this often? Penny couldn't help her curiosity. There were less than no sparks between the two of them. She couldn't see herself considering a man who shushed her right out of the gate. But if he was a regular, he was a good research subject. Every week, Norman replied. My mom says if I don't put myself out there, I'll never find anyone. Well, she's a smart lady. That's what I'm always telling everyone. Norman leaned over the table, extending his hands toward Penny. Does he want to hold my hands? She removed her hands from the table and placed them in her lap. What do you do? She asked, trying to move the subject away from his mom. Well, I used to run the dry cleaners down the street, but they shut down, so I'm between jobs right now. Strike 3. This fast date was going nowhere even faster. Norman was probably a genuinely nice guy, but there were a lot of nice guys out there that weren't right for her. She tapped her toe, anxious for the bell to ring. Norman wasn't asking her anything about herself, and she wasn't sure what else to ask him. He wasn't a good sample interview, even of the speed dating process, since he'd likely seen little success. Ding! Nice to meet you, Norman. Penny nodded at the man as he stood and rushed to the next table. With any luck, he felt the lack of sparks there as well. Penny shook her head and turned to the next man that sat across from her. Hey, the name's Pete, he said, extending his hand to shake hers. Penny. I should have guessed. When I was over there, he glanced at his former table, I was thinking you were as pretty as a penny. Penny smiled. It was cheesy, but at least it was a compliment. Plus, she liked his red hair and freckles. They made him look friendly and kind. What do you do, Pete? I'm a restaurant manager. You? A writer. Ah, beautiful and creative. I like it. Don't you think we'd have the loveliest children? Excuse me? Penny's eyebrows shot up. Children, you know, we have red hair. I have red hair. The kids wouldn't stand a chance. I don't know about you, but I think redheads are special. There's something unique about us. Well, that's true. Penny wasn't sure about discussing kids within the first 2 minutes of their relationship, but she did like his take on red hair. It wasn't something she'd always liked about herself, but it definitely made her stand out. Pete asked about her family, and she told him about her sisters. He spoke about his older brother and how they were still best friends even as adults. When he stood after the bell rang, he gave Penny a brief hug in her seated position and moved to the next table. She watched him go. Perhaps the night wouldn't be a total waste. She turned to greet the next man and caught a glimpse of the one sitting at the table just before hers. His broad shoulders came into view, and Penny flushed with anger. Menaeus, she muttered under her breath, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me, the man sitting across from her sprawled into his chair. Sorry, Penny tried to focus on him, but it was hard to tear her gaze from George Menaeus. His chiseled jaw and too long hair had held her attention on and off for the better part of the evening. Now that she could actually see him and knew who he was, she was even more intrigued. But not in a good way. I'm Penny, and you are? Anthony. The man went on to go through the get-to-know-you motions. Penny did her best to answer and tried to even smile and flirt, but her heart and mind weren't in it. Anthony was a nice-looking man with his olive skin and dark eyes, but George was next, and there wasn't anything Penny could do to pull herself back from that. Was there an exit nearby? Perhaps she could just slip out for the next 2 minutes and return after he left her table. Ding! It was nice talking to you, Penny. She snapped out of her thoughts long enough to notice that Anthony had taken her hand in his and was pressing it to his lips. Perhaps she made a better impression than she thought. She turned on her 100-watt smile, hoping George would think she was having the time of her life. Anthony left, and Penny took a deep breath. Her table was against the wall, and there was no way out without being seen. Plus, he'd been at the next table over. Surely he had noticed her as she had him. Penny glanced over in time to see George giving the girl next to her a long hug. Her fingers trailed down his muscular arm hesitantly, as if she didn't want to let him go. Penny rolled her eyes. Of course George was the nicest-looking man here. He was often the nicest-looking man in any room, but that didn't make him worth that woman's time. Steeling her nerves, Penny waited for George to join her. Well, 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 he clucked as he sat in the chair before her. Pretty little Penny, what do we have here? Good to see you too, George. Penny's voice melted with sarcasm. It's Geo. Penny scoffed. Of course it was. That was much more on the trend than an old-fashioned name like George. How's everything going in the freelance world? Penny asked with a wave of her hand as if she hadn't a care in the world. Better than ever. And how's everything going in my job at St. Louis Happenings? His job? Had he really just said that? Penny's frown deepened. You haven't held that job in well over a year, and I don't want to brag or anything, but my editor said I'm the best person the magazine has ever had in that position. It should have been my job all along, never yours even for the minute you held it. George nodded, a small smirk growing on his lips. Penny needed to scale it back a bit. She'd said too much. She was letting him get to her, and he knew it. What are you doing speed dating, Geo? I never thought you had a shortage of women. I never knew you noticed. Penny exhaled, trying to keep her face from turning a deeper red than it already was. Her history with Geo, wasn't a pleasant one, and this wasn't helping the memory she had of working with him at the magazine. I didn't, she said through clenched teeth. Well, whatever the magazine has you doing now, George said as he leaned forward and stared into her eyes, it looks good on you. Penny tilted her head. Was he hitting on her? Of course he was. That's what he was there to do. It was speed dating after all. He was probably trying to see how many numbers he could walk away with at the end of the night. I'd say the same for you, but, Penny began. You don't have to say it, Penny. George raised his eyebrows. I saw you checking me out earlier. What are you talking about? Penny blushed as she thought about her initial attraction to the man with the broad shoulders, the man sitting across from her now. But that was before he revealed himself as George Geo Maneas. Oh, come on, I can feel your eyes all over me. Geo ran his hands up and down his chest, chuckling. Penny rolled her eyes and tapped her fingers on the table. You flatter yourself. No, Geo stopped and placed his hand on top of hers on the table. You flatter me. Penny jerked her hand away and ran it over her shirt. It crinkled beneath her touch as she struggled with a comeback. Even though he'd bested her into silence, their connection felt oddly good. Familiar, even. She remembered when they'd first been introduced at the magazine. Their conversations had always flowed well. When he came up with something sarcastic, she had something to say in retort. There was never a shortage of laughter and teasing between them. I saw your article on school lunches. That was some good stuff, Geo broke the silence. Not for the schools. Geo shook his head. Perhaps not, but it's likely to bring about real change. The kids are going to get better meals out of it, and really that's what it's all about, isn't it? Making a difference? Who was this guy? Penny frowned. She remembered the George she worked with when they first teamed up, but toward the end he was all Geo, even if that wasn't what people called him at the time. And your behind-the-scenes article on the trash collector's life was really intriguing. She decided to test the waters. I know. Geo smiled, the cocky air returning. Penny wasn't sure what to say next. She got a hint of the old George and a whole load of Geo. What was she to make of it? Ding! Perfect timing. Penny closed her mouth and shrugged. Time's up. Good to see you, Geo. She lied, the sarcasm evident in her voice. Nice to be seen. George placed his hands on the table, pushed himself away, the veins in his arm showcasing his tight skin. Penny tried not to stare. She could resist any man despite his handsome features, especially when she knew what kind of a person he was. She watched him walk to the next table with his clipboard, wondering what he was scribbling about her. When he sat down before the next woman in line, he received a flirtatious grin. Penny shook her head and turned her attention to the next man in line. He wore a Star Trek t-shirt and a goofy grin. The evening wore on, and Penny did her best to focus on each man before her. She needed as much research as she could get to form the article. Her editor expected the best from her. That's why she was given the assignment. That, and because she was the only single person on staff. She wanted to show everyone she was the right person for the job, not just because she was single, but more because she was a stellar writer and an even better investigative reporter. When the final ding rang through the air, Penny sighed in relief. She considered herself an introvert, and it was hard to meet all these new people and put on her best front for that long. Gentlemen, return your clipboards to me. I trust you had a good time and that you've been keeping up with your markings on each lady. Penny glanced around at the other women. Everyone was staying at their table, so she did as well. The men filed to the women at the front table and turned in their papers and then gathered on the other side of the room. Ladies, now's your chance to make any final marks by the men's names, and I'll call you up one at a time. Penny studied the form before her. Each man was listed by their first name and a number. They weren't in the order she saw them, but she remembered them well enough. They were all unique in their own way. She had to walk away with at least one connection, for research's sake, at least, right? She wasn't sure which of the men she impressed the most, if any. She and Pete had a good rapport, and the man with the Star Trek shirt couldn't take his eyes off her after they spoke. In fact, she could feel someone staring at her now. Her gaze flitted over to the men. It was dark, but she didn't see that shirt anywhere. Instead, the broad shoulders came into sight. She could be wrong, but she was almost certain that Gio Meneas winked at her. What was that supposed to mean? It was unnerving enough seeing him there, given their history. Penny shook her head. She might regret this later, but she placed a wide circle around every name on the clipboard. She needed a connection for her article, and this was the best way to get it. She'd say she wasn't choosy and that she was really looking for a partner in life. She'd enjoyed her conversation with every man. Okay, so she'd lie. But it was what it was. She had to succeed in finding someone by the end of the featured articles. She couldn't fail to have at least one match on the very first round. Penny zeroed in on Gio's name. He was included in her wide circle. She started scratching at his name with the pen so the women in charge of the event would understand he wasn't included in the circle. The pen wasn't working well under the stress she was putting it under. She tore a bit of the paper around Gio's name. That should work. Miss Penny Coin? The lady at the front table finally called her up to turn in her paper. Oh, wow, she said as she took in Penny's circle on the page. Penny nodded her hands. I'm a bit desperate, she claimed in a low voice. Any man will do, really. The woman gave her the once-over. I see. She nodded as if she'd seen such actions before. Penny tugged at her tight, reflective shirt and wondered why the host didn't offer her any kind words. You deserve to be pickier, dear, she could have said, or, why would a beautiful girl like you want to settle? Instead, she ran her finger down her list of men looking for matches. It looks like you are due 2 phone numbers, she said. She moved her pen over to a post-it note. Wow, the official matchmaking post-it. These 2 men will get your number as well. We wish you the best of luck. We'll be here again next week if you'd like to have another round. Penny grabbed the paper from between the woman's fingers and nodded her thanks. She most definitely would not be back. She had 2 numbers. That was enough to give her story something extra beside the details she'd gleaned from the evening. She had time on her side. She had plenty of other dating avenues to try. So what if she hadn't met the one? She had to keep her eye on the goal, a front cover feature and a new boyfriend to boot. As she left the restaurant, relief flooded over her. She unfolded the paper. She clutched in her hand to reveal 2 phone numbers next to neatly scrawled names. Pete, the first one read. Next to that, Penny rolled her eyes when she read Gio.